Good morning, bonjour. Sorry not to be with you physically, but I think you all know why, and I will talk a little bit about the strike later on in my talk. Before we go on, I need to get to the next slide, a warning, and that is to be very clear. I am not a modeler. I've just been very fortunate for part of my life to be able to pay a lot of modelers to work for me. And so I am not up to date anymore in the modeling disciplines or in the modeling literature. And so what I'm going to present to you today is an outside perspective, which basically challenges your community to take a broader view. And I think doing that during this particular strike, as you will see later on, I think is actually very, very appropriate. Last of all, this is a work in progress. And so this is thinking that is going on, which I'm evolving. And this is far from a finished sort of paper, but it shares some ideas of where I am right now with you all. So we have known for a long time, for at least 40 years, that there is a possibility. Initially, we thought it was a possibility about climate and environmental change. Right now, we know that that is real. We are reaching or exceeding planetary boundaries, and you're all familiar with the figures that Johan and others, including myself, published in 2009 about that. But what more and more I am worried about is that our science has not been very impactful. We have reached a relatively small community in the world, and there are very large numbers of people who don't, for one reason or other, either understand what we're trying to say or even want to hear what we're trying to say. And so I think that is a reason to reflect on what our science is all about, and maybe to change some of its ways of thinking so that we can actually have more impact. And part of what I'm going to be talking about is the result of a conference that we held with the support of the Volkswagen Foundation in Potsdam in March about how we might want to reassess our actual science. But I'm going here in this talk way beyond that. So let's go. And you can, I mean, this is just some images because I like to have some images in this talk, but I don't think I have to explain any of them to you. I think you all know what this is all about and what this is all about. So the conclusion of all of that for me is that global warming is real, and our Western societies are in a very large part responsible for what has been happening over the last century, and in particular since about 1945. And we will have to act. But, and this is a real issue, unfortunately for many of the countries in the south of the the southern hemisphere, they will also suffer, and they will also have to act, although they are not initially responsible for what is actually going on. But what I want to do in this talk is to go beyond that and to basically say, okay, global warming is there. Global warming is a process that will take and make major changes over this century. But there are other processes that are going on that are also going to impact us in a major way. And some of those are impacting us on a much shorter timescale. And I'm going to be looking at some of those that I mentioned here: the demography, the economy, the complexity, the resource availability, and as a general sense, the stability of our socioeconomic system. And I want to begin that with this image. This is the center of Metro Manila on the left-hand side. It is a huge debris town, which is at the mouth of the Pasig River, and which is one of the most shameful shanty towns that you can imagine. But as you all know, they are everywhere. They're in South Africa, they're in other parts of South America, like Brazil, and so on. At the same time, I was for the first time in Dubai in 2003, and that was a local fishing town. with some trade, but only trade with dhows, the traditional Arabic ships. Now this is what Dubai is all about. And so what we've been seeing, and which is I think the most visual aspect of what is going on socially, is the fact that we have a huge discrepancy in wealth stretching all over the world and stretching within most countries. And I think that that wealth discrepancy is the result of 5 centuries of an imbalance in information processing, in which Western countries, Europe, the United States, have used their information processing advantage to actually basically take resources, both human and material, from all over the world and concentrate them in their own countries, which has made those countries very rich and which has hugely impoverished or kept impoverished many parts of the world. Now, to show that in more detail, I want to show you some statistics. And they're a bit crowded on this particular slide, but I didn't want to bore you with endless ones of them. The top left is a question of population growth. And what it shows in particular is that the yellow line, the red line, which is Asia, is sort of leveling out, whereas Africa, the blue line, is exploding on us. On the right-hand side at the top line is a very interesting graph that shows the wealth discrepancy worldwide between the poorest countries on the left and the richest countries on the right. So basically, wealth discrepancy increases with overall GDP. What you see in the next line on the left-hand side is the difference between productive and speculative investment in the United States. And what you see particularly is that over the last years, the speculative investment, which is basically simply playing the stock exchange, is actually taking in much, much more money than anything that is productive for our societies. That is not unrelated from the fact that you have this huge explosion in debt over the last 20 years in particular, even accelerated from 2008 onward, and it's separated here between the US, the developed world, ex-US, and the emerging markets. What you see on the right-hand side, those two graphs are interesting because they show how between the Anglo countries and continental Europe, the wealth discrepancy has changed. In about 1980, Reagan and Thatcher opened up and basically called it the Big Bang of the stock exchanges in New York and in London. And as a result, the wealth discrepancy in the Anglo countries has very steeply increased. The continental system is much more modest in that sense because it is much more closely focused on equality. And so you don't see that explosion there so much, although it is a little bit there. Now, what you see on the lower level, on the left-hand side, is the percentage of total wealth that is in the hands of people on the right-hand side in the red line that have very large incomes. And on the left-hand side, you see that the percentage of people having very low incomes in the blue line is actually very, very high, and how that has changed over the last few decades. And then an interesting aspect of all of this is the change in innovativeness. And we have worked very extensively on the data in the United States' patent database. And what we see there, and what we see reflected also in the various censuses that have been done of that, is that you begin to see fewer and fewer creations of new firms. And now there are more deaths of firms than there are creations, which of course says something about the innovativeness of the country. And you see the same thing on the right-hand side in that particular graph, where you basically see that the return on invested capital as measured by assets and measured by investment is actually going down quite severely. and makes it very difficult for people to start reinvesting in things if they are capitalists. Now, let's go and look a little bit. We have this crisis that I'm showing you there, this instability of the system and everything else. But now, what drives societies? And I think this is something where I differ from many other people. I would argue that the real thing that drives all these phenomena are differences in information processing. And why am I saying that? Because clearly humans process matter, energy, and information. But of course, matter and energy are subject to the law of conservation. And so they cannot be shared. So matter and energy flows cannot create a society, because a society is based on shared values, shared ideas. And so information processing is actually the thing that creates a society. And how that information processing goes and how it structures the society is something that we need to look at if we want to come to grips with some of the differences that I have actually just sort of outlined. So it's coherence in society. It is creating the structure and the institutions. The institutions are basically collective information processing tools that are shared by all the people that are participating in the society. The information processing also determines how we behave, what we do, what our values are, what our technologies are, what our artifacts are. All those things are aspects of information processing in societies. And what I'm basically arguing in the rest of this talk and in much of my work altogether is that a number of things need to be taken into account. One of the things that in science we don't take into account very much is anticipation. We always talk about feedback loops. We never look at feed-forward loops. We need to reassess all of that, and we take into account learning. But also, and this is something where we've had a debate, we are basically not often linking all of this to organization. And so what I am arguing here is that the information processing over time is responsible for a co-evolution of knowledge, science, culture, institutions, technology, economy, and the environment. Now then, the question, of course, is, okay, that may be true, but what drives this as an ultimate driver? What is responsible for the evolution of all of that? And now I'm going to skip one slide because I inserted one that Victor doesn't have that shows in an image what I'm actually talking about. And what I'm saying is, okay, human information processing is a question of interaction between observations and ideas or knowledge to interpret them. But those two resonate, but they're never completely coterminous. And so what you see is that there is an interaction between the world outside us and our ideas about that world, in which whenever we have a problem, we see a problem, we try and solve it. Solving that enhances our knowledge. That knowledge enhances our vision of the world and thereby helps us see yet other problems. And so there is a feedback loop between seeing those problems and increasing the knowledge to deal with them. And that, I think, is actually what is driving all of our information processing and the evolution that we see in information processing. For those of you who want to know more about that, I am publishing, I hope this month, with Cambridge University Press, a book about all of this, which is called Social Sustainability, Past and Future. Now, let's go on to the next slide then. What you see, if you look with my archaeologist eyes, which sort of takes things in thousands of years, at the long-term evolution of the human species, we first find that it took humans about 2 million years to be able to actually master matter. That is, make anything that they want out of stone tools, out of other materials, out of pottery, out of metals, and things like that. It took us about 12,000 years as a species to get control over the environment. From the first moment where people start cultivating cereals or having herds or things like that, to the moment where we are now, where we basically in the Anthropocene control much of our environment. For energy, it took us much less. We started about 250 years ago in a transition from natural energies, animal and human energies, to fossil energies. And as we see now, we have become completely controlled by and controlling all that fossil energy. But the last revolution that we're in is in some ways, from what I said just before, the most important one, because we're beginning to master information itself, the processing of information itself. And that will, we're only at the beginning of that process, make very, very profound changes in our societies, and I will talk a little bit about those in a moment. The time over which this will happen is actually relatively short. We have seen how the information technology has changed our world in the last 50 years, and we expect that every 5 or 7 years there is a new information technology revolution. And we also know from past experience that it takes society about 15 to 20 years to actually catch up with that information revolution. And so we're being overtaken by our way of mastering information. And so that is a major warning sign for us for the future. Now, the really fundamental thing that has been happening over the last few years is because of the web and the fact that now everybody can communicate with everybody else, whether individual to individual or individual to group or so on and so forth, we are now losing complete control over the values in our society because we are fuzzing the boundary between what are signals and what is noise. Clearly, in the past, signals were those things that sort of conformed with the values we had, because that is how we then took them to be signals. And everything else was discarded as noise. Now that everybody can express their opinion in different ways, we actually are hitting a problem with that particular effect. And I will be talking about that over the next few slides in a little bit more detail, because I think it is a very, very fundamental aspect of what is going on in the world right now, and an aspect that we need to start including in our modeling. And that is why this whole message is addressed to yourselves, because I think the subject of our modeling over the next few generations is going to have to be the collision between climate change and societal change. And that is something we haven't really looked at in any major detail so far. So, what are the positives of the ICT revolution? And you can see these, they're all very self-evident. We can treat much more information. We gather much more information through sensors. I've just bought a new car, and the car doesn't quite drive itself yet, but all kinds of things start happening totally unexpectedly for me. We have GPS, we have remote sensing, we have smartphones, we have the World Wide Web, we have a lot of social interaction. And in particular, as I said a moment ago, we have messaging that is now going from one to one, but from one also to many, from many to one, and many to many. So we are in this huge explosion of what is called information, but which officially really is only information insofar as it relates to our values and actually reinforces the signals in society. And as I said a moment ago, that is actually no longer happening so easily. So the negatives are some of the hacking, the loss of privacy, but I think a very, very important one that is now sort of emerging is the whole idea of the surveillance society, the increase of control over everything that we do. And another one that I think brilliantly came out the day after Donald Trump was appointed president is the idea of alternative truths. That is, everybody has a different vision, and so there are as many truths as there are visions, and that is making it very, very difficult to maintain a degree of coherence of our societies. Now, there are a number of deeper effects that I want to spend a little bit of time on, because I think they are some of the very fundamental trends that are going on that are disintegrating our current societal order. And they are not new, and they are not caused by the IT revolution, but they are heavily accelerated by the IT revolution. And the first one I've already mentioned is this thing about signal and noise. What does it mean? It means that we have fewer shared categories and shared values. And you can see that all over the world. Protests against what were used to be sort of accepted values are all over the place. The alternative truths are part of that. But what is much more important is that that is beginning to get us to lose the structure in our thinking. It is making us, in a sense, compassless in how we want to behave. And that is part of what the disintegration that we see around us is all about. Some simple examples: the erosion of conception of space and time. Because of the web now, place, territory, and boundary are all under attack. That is how countries start interfering in the politics of other countries. But it also is the fact that we don't have a sense of place anymore, because anybody can be anywhere as long as they're connected with the web. The whole effort of Estonia creating e-citizenship for anybody in the world in Estonia, even though they may live in Tierra del Fuego, is a very interesting example of what is happening there. At the same time, our perspective on time changes. For a long time, time was measured in hours or in days. And that was so that it could accommodate the way of necessarily meeting between people when those people had very different perspectives on time. It's the mañana effect, right? If we don't define time very precisely, it may well be that we actually end up, yes, maybe meeting each other, but meeting each other in a very wide temporal margin. That is changing. We are now into nanoseconds. And that means that our whole society has hugely changed in its temporal aspects. And some people argue that that is increasing the efficiency. That may be true in a sort of superficial economic way, but it may not be so effective for the actual well-being of the people involved. Now, on a very different scale, and not so global, we are also beginning to see the erosion of the global diplomatic world order. That world order was established in 1648 in Europe and was based on two things: autonomy of each prince or leader in their own territory to do whatever they felt they wanted to do, and on the other hand, a balance of power between the major blocks of power in Europe that made it sort of a more or less stable situation. Well, what we see now, as I said, is an erosion of that autonomy. People are now interfering in elections. People are trying to impose particular value systems, like our democratic value system, on countries where that is not normally the case. Look at the Near East, look at China, for example. So we are beginning to see how that diplomatic world order is eroding away and how we're losing the kind of balance of power that have. Now, I'm not saying that there won't be a different balance of power. What I am saying is that it will be much more difficult to maintain whatever balance of power there is because of the information revolution. In a similar way, there is a real erosion of our democratic systems. We have seen in a number of countries over the last few years that there's been major changes, that whole parties have become irrelevant. And I think part of that is due to the two things. On the one hand, political parties that are the basis of our democratic system were the way in which politicians connected with the population. Right now, that is no longer necessary for the politicians. The Cambridge Analytica scandal has shown how, and this has already happened much before, for example, with the election of Obama, how particular corporations have so many social data about every single individual that they can actually more or less predict which people are going to vote how and whether they're going to be voting and things like that. So the political party is becoming much, much less important. But at the same time, because of these multiple information sources that we have now within each society, what we see is that all those classical democratic parties are basically being wiped out by new ones, some of them extremely ephemeral. For example, the sardines movement that you now see in Italy since the last month and a half as a reaction against the politics that were being imposed by the extreme right in Italy. We see, and I think this is even more fundamental, erosion of communities. And that's a long-term trend. That's a trend that started with the big migration to urban contexts. Because in urban contexts, people are separated from their communities to a wider extent than is possible in rural situations. And so what you effectively see is that people have been individualized. People are losing the sense of community that was an important source of stability for them because it limited their behaviors, because people knew that they were dependent on each other and therefore could not alienate everybody so that they could still call on help from people. And so there is a very fundamental underlying trend by which our communities are being eroded away and are being replaced by societies that are entirely based on individuals rather than on communities. And I think that is a fundamental trend underneath all of it, which I think is actually quite a very major change in political outlook, in social structure, in institutional structure, and so on and so forth. So what I'm basically arguing is that the ICT revolution has accelerated a number of underlying trends that were already going on, but that they are now going so fast and that they're beginning to converge so that we have no idea where the future of the complex system that was our world global organization is actually going. And I think that is one of the very, very difficult things that we're beginning to have to look at, because it is fundamental to where we are and what we do. Okay, some institutional changes that have sort of gotten the attention of the literature. One of them is the destruction of the middle classes, because wealth discrepancies are growing and there is very substantive chance of underemployment because of automatization and things like that. But we also see that there has been a growing imbalance between the urban and the rural. I am always struck by the fact that when I talk in sustainability contexts about cities, I hit a particular audience that only specialize in sustainability of cities. Others look at this, the sustainability of rural areas, for example, the agroecology movement. And as a result of that, we're beginning to see a separation there between what is urban and what is rural, which actually, I think, makes both of those systems much more vulnerable. And that's not sort of underrate the following. Everybody predicts that by the end of the century, more than 80% of the world population will be living in urban systems. I don't believe that. I believe that urban systems are incredibly vulnerable. They demand huge investments. They demand huge flows, long distance flows of foodstuffs. And they are created by the need to actually process information together. And as the web allows us now to do that at a distance, and for example, today and yesterday here in France, a lot of people, more than usual, worked from home because it was possible, and so they didn't have to hit the strikes. You actually see that urbanization as a structural system is quite vulnerable. And I'm not so sure that we will not see increasing in transport costs, an increase in food insecurity, and also an increase in the facility of information processing, so that the energy constraint is becoming more and more important. And then finally, I want to point out to some work that's been done by Brian Arthur, that technologically it may be possible that we hit over the next 20 or 30 years a situation in which most things that humans need can actually be made by machines. That becomes a big challenge, because it means not only that we have to change our economies, but that everybody in the world, in the current situation, most people at least, actually determined their own values and their own identities by the role they play in the production process. If that process is no longer essential, what is going to determine people's identities? What is going to determine the way people think about themselves? On top of that, we will have to recreate a very different economy that is not based on production, but that is based on distribution, which means that the political aspect is becoming more and more important. Another thing that we're actually seeing in the current strike movement here in France, which is all about redistributing retirement, basically. So, a number of insecurities there. Now, all of this, to my mind, has been accelerated by the spread of communication across the world, and the web is an important part of that, but it is also has had a very nefarious effect. Different cultures in different parts of the world, as long as they were isolated or more or less isolated, had mostly their own values. In the current globalization wave, those values are basically replaced by common values. The complexity of those common values could never replace the complexity of the individual values in the different cultures. And so what we see is a simplification of our value system to one that is essentially focused on wealth. And I think that is a really major factor in the destruction of our communities. Sociologically, people in a community have basically two desires. They want to be part of a community, and they want to be an individual, a recognized individual within that community. Now, the problem is, if you reduce the number of dimensions of variation within the community by measuring everything according to wealth, you have many fewer opportunities to actually be your own individual within that community. I am often reminded about a phrase that a systems engineer said to me in the 70s, and he basically said, you know, why do you think people always drive faster and faster on highways? It is because if you if you limit their possibility to distinguish themselves to one dimension, which in this case is speed, they will actually go for that. The same is happening for our wealth discrepancy. The more we actually emphasize the idea of wealth as the main distinguishing characteristic between individuals, the more wealth discrepancy you're going to get. And so a high-dimensional value system is actually needed to maintain communities in good order. And globalization is effectively destroying that. So I also would argue that globalization is at the root of emerging rebellions and populism that we see all over the place And I have a personal experience with that by talking to a number of those yellow vests that over this last year have emerged all over France. And I think their main driver, yes, is financial. But underneath that driver is the loss of valued identity. People no longer feel part of feel valued by their community, by their nation. And I think that is one of the drivers of the societal upheaval that we're actually seeing. So then we get the problem that all of this is accelerating with the acceleration of the information revolution. On the left-hand side, you see a representation of Moore's law and the exponential explosion of the capability to process information. And on the right-hand side, from the work of Dirk Helbing, you see here some graphs, and they're imaginary, but they give a trend of the difference in the acceleration of processing power, the acceleration in data volume that is being processed, and that is the really important one here, the increase in systemic complexity that is due to the interaction between all those new elements. And so what I'm arguing here is that humans cannot keep up with that acceleration, and that is going to throw our societies in even more painful situations. And this is what comes out of that. And I don't have to explain all of these images, but they all reflect one thing, and that is a worldwide wave of anger. An anger that has been underground for a long time, but that actually is now beginning to explode. And the interesting thing is that a lot of that explosion actually is directly related to the climate change. And effectively that is because it is one sort of tangible theme around which people can express their unhappiness. And it's very real. In the US, 70% of millennials think that climate change will change their lives. Climate change-related depression in the US is steeply increasing. And I'm talking about clinical depression. I'm not talking about people just having a bad mood. So one of the things that I think is happening right now is that climate change is the banner for a worldwide wave of unhappiness and change that we've been seeing growing over the last decade or two. And so we've seen it in the Arab Spring, we see it in Hong Kong, we see it in Chile, we see it in Catalonia, in Beirut, Syria, Iraq, Indonesia, Algeria, all those places, unhappiness is emerging. And I think we need to begin to think about those things in terms of our modeling, but I'll get back to that in a moment. The support for alternative truths, the Trump, the Brexit, Bolsonaro, people like that. So political populism is in many places emerging. Hungary, Poland, the rise of the extreme right in West. So all those movements, I think, are beginning to show that we're reaching a tipping point in the stability of our system. And that is what this slide is all about. And so what we're beginning to see is that resistance movement. It is focused on climate change. We see authors, the Le Monde over this past summer has, and it still does, has a whole series of articles about what they call collapsology, people who are afraid that everything will collapse. And one of the questions we need to ask is, what is the role of science in that position? Because after all, the climate change debate has been triggered by science, and it's been triggered in a sort of catastrophism-like way, which was not always very helpful in creating and thinking about new ideas. So these sorts of things are right now in an intermediate stage. When I was talking to the Yellow Vests, the impression came to me that we're at the stage, for example, where the revolution was in Russia in 1905. When it emerged, it didn't win, and then 12 years later, it actually came out even stronger. One of the interesting things, for example, is that the Yellow Vests over the last 9 months, these people have met and they met with very different senses of uneasiness, discontent. And little by little, on those roundabouts, by discussing every Saturday about the situation, they begin to develop a political philosophy. Well, that's a really interesting thing, because it is a political philosophy that ultimately will have to confront the current system. So the question is then, will this movement ultimately cohere globally? And I don't think it is going to cohere in a very strict sense, but I do think we're going to see, because of the facilitation of information processing, that there is going to be more and more interaction between different parts of the world on this score. One symbol here is the interesting use in all parts of the world, and this is Barcelona, Seoul, Accra, and Managua, of Guy Fawkes masks. Guy Fawkes was the man who in the 17th century tried to blow up the British Parliament by hiding powder in casks in the basement of the building. And he was caught before it could actually happen. But there is a day in the year, somewhere in October or November, I seem to recall, in which Guy Fawkes is a hero in Britain. And what we now see is that the mask that is associated with Guy Fawkes is actually appearing all over the world. Okay, that's what I think has been happening. Now, let's get to our own work. What I'm arguing here is that our societal context has changed so profoundly that we need to fundamentally rethink what we are modeling and how we approach it. And in particular, that we have to start modeling the oncoming collision between individual and social planetary boundaries. Our community has focused on the environmental dynamics and their consequences for society, but we have paid insufficient attention to the long-term drivers that cause the current predicament. Those drivers, as I'll show in the next slide, actually began in the 14th century and have sort of enlarged and widened their scope ever since. What happened in the 14th century? We see three waves of the plague running over Europe, diminishing in very major percentage the number of people in Western Europe, and in particular killing huge numbers of people in urban systems. What we see just after that is very interesting. We see a change in attitude to the relationship between life and death. Until that moment, that relationship was essentially sort of cyclical. Life became death and death became life. But now, under the new numbers of the deaths, we begin to create a different vision of that, and we begin to see life as one thing and death as the end of life. And so because of that, we get a completely different vision of dead things, things that do not change. And as a result of that, and this is very brilliantly described by a British historian called Everenden, we begin to build a wall between those approaches that link human beings and life and change, and those approaches that actually don't deal with change, don't deal with life. And so this is the beginning, in a sense, of the separation between nature and culture, which later becomes sort of fused again in biology, but I'm not going to be talking about that very much. But let's look at the next step. The next step is in the 16th century. We begin to discover other continents. Initially, that is the beginnings of globalization, but it's only very light, because what Western countries do is they create little trading posts in very faraway countries. But from about 1800, those places where they were imposed actually become colonies in the sense that they become places where part of the raw materials for the mother countries are being created. So there becomes a very heavy materials flow from those colonies to Western Europe and the United States. And so from that moment on, you see human and natural resource exploitation exploding all over the world, but all focused on Europe and the Western world. So colonization and colonialism is an important part of what is driving us to unsustainability, basically. A next stage of that is the Enlightenment, is the emergence of science, which accentuates the difference between nature and culture, which gives science an increasingly important role in our Western thinking. And we can talk about that, and I have some comments about that, which I don't think fit here, but I think we need to be very careful in how we actually assess the role of our science itself in the whole sustainability debate. In around 1800, we start the Industrial Revolution. Energy is no longer a constraint, and so innovation explodes. Long-distance transport explodes. You get the colonial production empires. We get, again, another step that leads us to where we are now. Then in the 1840s, according to anthropologists, we actually see that there is a really interesting inversion between the roles of society and the economy. Until that moment, in general, the economy was sort of a part of the society that made it possible to exchange things and so on and so forth. But what we begin to see from the 1840s is that the society becomes at the service of the economy. That is the foundation of the capitalist system. Then in the 1920s, we begin to see advertising. And because of advertising, we begin to see mass marketing. Then in the 1950s, we get the Bretton Woods system. Democracy is safeguarded for a while, but it is safeguarded at the cost of increasing consumerism so that everybody stays happy. That then, again, creates a bigger discrepancy between the West and other countries. So what I'm basically saying is that we need, as social scientists, to make an effort in better understanding not so much how the environment impacts on society, but how society has come to the point where it is now in the Anthropocene of controlling the environment and what the real underlying drivers of that are. And so my argument here is that the dynamics are driven by society, that we have not looked at that because when we started around 2000 to involve more and more social scientists in the sustainability debate, the questions that were being asked were basically being asked by the natural sciences who had gotten into this debate much earlier. You can see that in the early debates in the IPCC, for example. Sorry, French and English here are battling in my mind. So the predicament is being argued is an environmental one. I don't think so. I think the challenge is not an environmental one, but a societal one. It is society that defines what it considers its environment, what it considers the environmental problems, what it considers the solutions for those environmental problems. So it is in our own minds and in our societies that the real roots of the problem are hidden. And so we must begin to model from a societal perspective. We must begin to model the co-evolution of cognition, values, institutions, technology, economy, the environment. And I think that is the task that I want to throw at all of you, because I think that is what needs to be done most urgently. We must start asking different kinds of questions, the kinds of societal questions that you see here. And I'm getting a little bit to the end of my slides, so I need to move a little bit faster, and I will skip the details of that. But I want to emphasize that our current social science approaches are actually not suitable to do that. The social sciences, contrary to the natural sciences, have emerged in different societies focused on different issues and have much more difficulty actually beginning to link among each other. Many involve statistical analyses of very large groups, but analyses that are based on very limited samples. A couple of thousand people are inquired and are asked for their opinions, and then we actually use those dynamics to project over much, much larger numbers. And so I think there is a number of problems there where social sciences, under the impact and in the service of what needs to be done in modeling, are actually having to change. And a very, very important one is the fact that the social sciences are looking at relatively short-term phenomena, that is a century or two, because most of them don't have any sort of specific quantitative data for longer periods. And because they only look at relatively short periods, they have no understanding of the change of change, how the process of changing is changing itself over long-term time. For that, in my experience, you need at least a millennial perspective. But then there are more deeper challenges of Western science. Basically, this distinction between human and natural is a cultural distinction. There is no fundamental difference between human and natural subsistence. There are only interactions between people and other aspects of their environment. Moreover, in our Western philosophy, we focus very strongly on entities. We focus on identifying individual things. We focus on indicators, but we don't focus very much on relationships and interactions. Borges gives this wonderful example of saying, okay, divide the world in two. Give one half of the world verbs and no nouns, and the other one only nouns and no verbs. And then the first part can only talk about individuals, and the second part can only talk about relationships. We need to talk about both. And another thing that I find intuitively is very strong, that science has trained us to escape fuzziness, to escape ambiguity, because it serves to actually clarify things. I think we need to give much more space to fuzziness and ambiguity in what we do. We appropriate the environment, but can we invert that particular appropriation logic? And I think we can, and I'll show you in a moment how I think we can. And then finally, we need to see the future as an interaction between chance and necessity. Some of it is path dependent, but there is an opening for some novelty. So, question. Yeah? I thought we started 50 minutes ago. So you want me to shorten? Okay, well, I didn't count on that, but I'm happy to shorten that, because then I will simply go to one of the further slides, don't worry. I'm going to skip a lot then, in that case. I think what we need to start doing here is on this slide. We need to actually start designing for sustainable change. Rather than design for sustainable stability, we need to design for sustainable change. We need to focus on relationships rather than on entities. We want to work in open-minded, multiple future scenarios and accept the fact that there is ontological uncertainty. And now I will skip a whole bunch of things again. That is fine. I will simply very quickly go to a few challenges that I think we need to do with the information revolution. On the one hand, is we need to reintegrate society and ICT. We need to have people thinking more in computing terms and developing computer techniques that are more socially acceptable. We have to overcome our cognitive limitations. We can deal with limited sets of data in our mind and even with computers, but we need to go way beyond that if we're ever going to get a sense of how things work. We need to start focusing on emergence by design. We need no longer to sort of see things happening as a result of unintended consequences in the past, but actually start focusing on design itself. And this is what I was saying about unintended consequences. I think it's the unintended consequences of what has been happening over the last few centuries that have brought us to the tipping point where we currently are. So how are we going to deal with that particular issue? I think some of that will be helped by big data. Some of it will be helped by using much larger samples on which we test out our ideas. That is where the social sciences, I think, need to make a big change, and they can do it by creating artificial populations that they can then use for testing. And if they accord very large numbers of dimensions to the individuals in those populations, I think we can actually come to much better results from a societal point of view of what is actually going on. And then we need to begin to look at different temporalities, different spatial scales. We have this strange thing, and I'll explain it by looking at space. We look at 3 spatial scales, but because the phenomena are infinitely scalar in very different ways, by defining those scales, we come up with some particular vision, which is not necessarily the relevant vision. And so we need to change that. And then finally, I think high-performance computing can help us a lot in trying to sort of get all of this going. So I'm sorry that I ran out. I had thought that I would actually have 60 minutes to talk, but it's okay. You have a sense, and we can talk about some of those details. You will also be able to get the PowerPoint, which I've told Victor he can use, and I'm happy to converse or otherwise communicate about some of the other issues that are in this particular presentation. Thank you very much. Sure.
Just
That's your problem, not my problem.
Sander,
please.
You've thrown a lot of ideas at us, and I really regret that you haven't given us...
Sorry, I have a real hard time hearing you. You need to get closer to a microphone.
Okay. Okay, so you've thrown a lot of ideas at us, and I really regret that you are not giving us the opportunity of having at least a dinner with you to discuss some of them. But I will jump on one thing that you've said, which I think is highly relevant, and that has to do with the idea of, I would put it, dynamics versus statics.
Yeah.
Trying to preserve, you know, we had at the École Normale a series of talks associated with this Environmental Research and Teaching Institute that I started or restarted when I got here. And they had to do with ecology. And, you know, they had to do with this repository of seeds up in Svalbard. And the fact that we had a guy from the Museum d'Histoire Naturelle who seriously, you know, debated that in the sense that agriculture is also something living and evolving, and we don't want necessarily to keep yesterday's seeds, but nurture those of today and tomorrow. So I got a little bit upset at the talk that we had during this workshop about safe operating spaces. You know, the perfect safe operating space is a playpen. And, you know, we all have to get out of that at the age of a few months. And so likewise, I don't think that thinking statically is the way to do it. Aside from this, I fully agree with you about using both agent-based models and aggregated ones and comparing their performances. I've at least started doing that. So I'll leave the floor to some other people, but I really hope that you'll make it from your little farm outside Rennes into Paris sometime, that will have that dinner together to discuss this further.
Two very quick remarks. Yes, of course, I will make it again once transport becomes possible. The other thing is about Svalbard. The other thing that people don't do in Svalbard is to actually collect the data about how those various seeds are actually being used. And so they're decontextualized. And that ultimately will make that they're useless, because the contexts will have changed and we don't know the difference of the contexts. I discussed this while I was still teaching here in France with some of the people that are involved in France in the sort of preservation of those kinds of things, and they collect all the ways in which those seeds are used as information together with the seeds themselves.
Sander.
Yeah, please.
I want to misuse my role of chair just to get my question through to you. And that's what I thought about social science. I know that societies are very fragmented. So what you showed with Manila example and Dubai example, that both societies are more or less stable, but if you want to model them, they're just based on completely different principles and hierarchies and how they interpret things. So societies are very fragmented, and the question, that's why one of the reasons why it's incredibly hard to model them if you go to global scale. But do you think that globalization and the IT revolution actually would help us to model global society, because everything becomes more homogenized?
Well, my question is there whether that created homogeneity is not created at the cost of losing so many dimensions of the internal structure of different societies, that the actual models we come up with are no longer as effective as the knowledge within those societies. I have a real problem there that as a result of globalization, I think the model that is being projected all over the world is actually so oversimplified that it doesn't really work. And it's difficult for me to argue in detail why, but having worked in places like Syria in the 70s, in Papua New Guinea in the highlands in the 90s, I realize how profound those conceptual differences actually are. And I don't think our current state of information technology is actually able to capture that in the very different situations that we're working. So what I'm arguing is, yes, let's use the ICT, but let's not try and make global models, but let's try and make models that are directly relevant to specific cultures.
Thank you, Sander. Yeah, Jonathan has a question. Jonathan, can you just come here? It's easier. You use both microphones.
Great talk. Thank you, very inspiring. Yeah, I was just wondering, do you have a certain approach for modeling these dynamics in mind that you would recommend to start with? Anything like agent-based modeling networks or?
You know, when we talked a little bit more than a year ago in Hamburg about sort of beginning to develop new approaches, I think one of the ways in which we can begin to model societies in a very effective way is by looking at them as signal processing organizations. And that is a combination, I think, depending on the scale in which you want to do it, of agent-based modeling, but also very much sort of modeling in terms of multinets, for example. But again, I am not a specialist, as I said in my very early, my first slide. I also have in this particular presentation some more specific suggestions that I had to jump over for time reasons. So I would basically argue to Michael, why don't we organize an actual real working session between modelers and some people on the sort of edges of that community to see if we can develop some methods. I think that is where I am. As I said in the beginning, this is work in progress. I am working about conceptualizing this kind of approach, but I think there's so much work to be done that I don't have a solution that I can simply give you now.
Yeah, I'm looking at Michael, I think he agrees to this point.
Okay, good.
But I'm done organizing for a while.
I think he's have enough from organizing the meetings, that's also, I can understand.
Let's exchange emails about that, Michael, and then when I am back in Paris in some time, we can talk about it in more detail.
Yes, let's do that. Good.
Okay, Sander, thank you very, very much for being with us.
You're very welcome. It was a pleasure. And I'm sorry I didn't get to the end of it, but that's okay. All right, cheers.